For Polity in Johannesburg, I'm Darlene Creamer. Dominican priest and author, Father Mark James, joins me to discuss his insightful and methodical book, Proud to be Deaf: Ministry, Saintliness, and the History of the Catholic Deaf Community in South Africa, 1874 to 1994. Father Mark, your book traces the history of Catholic ministry to the deaf community in South Africa over 120 years. To begin, please can you share a bit about your own background and how your journey with the deaf community began?
I started working with the deaf community in about 2006. Two deaf people approached me in Springs, my hometown, and they knew my mother very well, and they knew my grandparents, who were both deaf. And they asked if I could come and minister to them once a month, because the priest who was doing the work at the time, Father John Turner, was aging and he was battling to come up regularly to celebrate with the deaf community in Johannesburg. So I said, well, I can help them, but I don't sign. They said, no, not to worry, because there is a young man, son of one of the deaf couple there, who would sign, and I would just be able to do the liturgy parts of things. So we started out, but afterwards we would have tea. And I found that I was able to engage with them quite freely. And the one guy said to me, Francois de Villiers, I'll teach you sign language, come to my house. And so we started learning gradually, bit by bit. And my ministerial approach became quite informal because of my poor signing. I would have to stop occasionally and say, what is the sign for this? And became a bit of a community dialogue, not just me leading the process. It was quite a new experience for me and a very challenging one. Then I became more involved in 2011 because I applied and was made the official chaplain for the deaf here in the Archdiocese of Johannesburg. And then I started working in Soweto as well. There was a community there. And then after that, 2018, I went to Swaziland, Eswatini, and I worked there for 7 years. And it was really there that my signing improved immensely because I was in daily contact with deaf people and was given quite a free hand to develop the ministry in quite creative ways there.
Historically, philosophers such as Aristotle believed that deaf people fell short of what it meant to be fully human. They were often dismissed as incapable of being educated. Speak to us about the philosophical shifts as human rights were emphasized.
Aristotle was a wonderful philosopher who contributed so much to our understanding of humanity, and he influenced, especially through people like Thomas Aquinas, Catholic theology immensely, and developed a whole thing of virtue ethics, that we have to live as good human beings. But based on his understanding is that what distinguished human beings from animals is our rationality, that we were able to think, we could think purposely, we could also think theoretically, we could also think autonomously or deliberatively, and make clear choices for our future. But the drawback with that perspective was that he also had this idea that some people embodied rationality more than others. So he distinguished between those who were more fully human and those who were less human or subhuman in some respects, because they were able to embody more fully the rationality or the logos that he said distinguished human beings. So women were often referred to as misbegotten males because the Greek philosopher, in fact, he based a lot of his thinking on himself in some respects. That's why Levinas takes issue with him. But he saw the Greek philosopher as the full embodiment of the human being who had leisure and time to think, and to think rationally and to make deliberative choices about one's life. But women were not allowed to be as fully human as that. They were human in the context of the home environment. Slaves, even though they were technically workers and had technical knowledge, they wouldn't have that autonomous type of thinking that qualified for full humanity. So they were considered less than as well. And then children were even lower than women and slaves. And so he sometimes argued that infanticide was justified in some instances, like crippled children or children who had physical disabilities or intellectual disabilities. They were less than human and so could be left to die. And deaf children too would have been considered part of that. Deaf children, however, it was noticeable much later, so many more, I suspect, survived. But it was based on that type of rational thinking that there were degrees of human beings in terms of their ability to be rational. And then gradually with the Enlightenment, Descartes and Kant, we get much more of a turn to the subject, where human beings are seen as people who have an innate dignity, and that there was this development of human rights, and people were not just to be discriminated according to their ability to be rational, but that they themselves had an innate dignity over and above their ability to be rational. And the limits with that was more with the turn to the linguistic or to language, where people like Levinas in the postmodern period began to recognize that it's not just about subjectivity or being a subject with authority and with agency that makes people human, but also the fact that we are different. And with languages, and languages are so different and cultures are so different, we get to begin to understand that human beings are not just to be the same, but also to be appreciated in their differences. And major shift philosophically in the last 50 years.
As you've mentioned, you also draw on the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, particularly his idea of saintliness as the ethical act of putting the needs of others before one's own. How does your book provide a lens to offer both a compassionate and critical reading of the deaf community's history?
In order to answer that question, you need to understand where Levinas was coming from. Levinas was born in 1906 and died in 1994. And he lived at a period when he himself grappled with the challenges, particularly of the Second World War. And he had become a phenomenologist and studied under the phenomenologists Husserl and Martin Heidegger. And he was a great fan of Martin Heidegger until 1933, when Heidegger came out in support of the Nazi Party. And then he realized that there was something horribly wrong with phenomenology, that they'd got some things wrong, that Heidegger could justify that type of fascist regime. And he began to rethink his phenomenology, and instead of basing it on concern for self and coming into an authentic humanity, he began to see that it was much more important to move the shift away from self-interest, that you become a better person. He began to see that the shift needed to be moved more towards people who were different, and to appreciate that shift as an education, as teaching us how to live a truly human life. So it's not about ourselves becoming authentic human beings, but creating a world environment or an environment where people in their differences can flourish and grow and become authentic human beings. His main idea behind that was the distinction between the Greek Homer's Odyssey and the Jewish idea of Abraham. Because he said Ulysses moves from his hometown, Ithaca, and he travels around as an explorer around the world, and eventually comes back home to Ithaca, and there he accomplishes his life's mission. But rather than that explorer attitude of people in the 18th and 19th centuries explored the unknown worlds, and came back with all the treasures that are in the British Museum and things like that. Levinas had the idea that what we really need to do is move into a new land like Abraham did. He left all he knew behind in order to move into a new reality. And for him, that meant going into the unknown and meeting people who we can't just take into our existing frames of reference and sort of possess them or take their knowledge and make it our own. He says that his writings are an attempt to come to grips with the differences among people and to realize that this puts us not into owning it as more of the same, and that we can grasp and understand them or even walk in their shoes, but they put us in a completely different reality, a new world, a new land. And so this idea of Abraham moving into the unknown is the sort of theme that the person who is different or other to us, rather than grasping what they have done and taking it into ourselves, we need to be ourselves recipients of their teaching, of learning from them, in order that we ourselves begin to appreciate that life is much more than we could have anticipated, and that it is this new world that is born through this engagement that we begin to come to a deeper appreciation of what it means to be human. So in that respect, he was against universal sort of ethical codes. His concern was much more to develop an ethic in relationship to the person who faces you at any one moment, and that you respond to that person ethically or compassionately or with great hospitality, and that you open up your life and your heart and your mind to their reality, and not just predetermine it or take it into your way of thinking, but appreciate it in its difference. So I use his thinking in that respect to try and help us hearing people appreciate the reality of deaf people, because this is a different world, vastly different to our hearing experience. And it was one which was looked down upon for many centuries because they were considered to be uneducatable. And then that gradually changed in the Renaissance period up until the present day. And now we're looking at deaf people as not just human beings who have a handicap or limitation, but we have much to gain from them as well. We can learn a lot about life and being human through interacting with them.
Could you speak about the concept of deaf gain, which seeks to move away from the notion of loss or disability and instead highlights the unique contributions that deaf people and deaf culture make to humanity?
The idea of deaf gain is a reaction to this emphasis that deaf people suffered under for many years, that they suffered hearing loss, so that they were handicapped or imprisoned in a life of silence. And because Aristotle and a lot of theology too thought that faith and education came through hearing first and foremost, and then also vocalization, speaking, there was that sense in which deaf people were like a bit second class because they were not quite able to engage in our hearing world to the same extent. And so because of their hearing loss, the idea was that you needed to repair that hearing loss. So it links with Levinas's idea that, you know, it's all a bit self-referential, that the determining factor is the hearing world. And so because they are suffering hearing loss, they need to be assisted, or they need to be helped, or they need some benevolent care. And deaf gain is this understanding that being deaf helps us understand the multi-dimensional aspects of what it means to be human. That being deaf is not necessarily a loss, but it can be a gain for humanity. And one of the most revelatory experiences of deaf gain was in the 1960s, when a theorist in the United States showed how sign language was essentially a language. Before, it had just been understood as gestures or sort of primitive way of communication. But he showed that rather than using words or sounds to communicate, sign language uses space and hand movement and facial movements and expressions in order to communicate. So in the 1960s, he was able to help deaf people understand that their language was a fully human language. And that's revolutionized our understanding of languages. So that's one of the deaf gains. The other one is that scientists have discovered that before a child can speak, if the parents and the child are taught signs, the child is able to express him or herself in terms of their needs, like hunger or thirst, and not just cry, cry, cry. That even hearing children and hearing parents can benefit from non-verbal communication through signs. Another gain would be things like architecture, because like particularly in our churches, they're not designed for people with disabilities in any respect. Deaf people need to be near the front of the church, and they prefer to be able to see what everybody is doing. So a sort of more circular image of church would be much more beneficial for them. Churches could be redesigned. The sort of pattern of sitting in pews, one behind the other, is not very helpful if the community is also being engaged in the service. The other problem is people who are in wheelchairs or on crutches themselves are also limited in their accessibility to the church. Often there are no ramps, or pews are very awkward places to keep crutches, for example. And so deaf gain is also a disability gain, that it informs our way of being human and community together. And this is a very important way of recognizing that we can learn from people who are other or different from us.
Can you elaborate on the various methods used to teach deaf individuals over the years? The oralist method was once seen as the best path to liberate deaf people from their silence, while the use of sign language was not only discouraged but even punished. Could you speak about this and also reflect on the important shift in the 1970s with the introduction of total communication?
With Aristotle in the early period, as I said, it was believed you couldn't educate deaf people. But there were always attempts by some, in some areas, to try and help deaf people communicate, because people saw that they were able to communicate with one another through signs. But they looked down upon those signs. But then gradually, around the 18th century, there was an attempt to really emphasize that deaf people could be educated. The first attempt was by a priest called Delapie in France, and he noticed there were some deaf children in his parish, and he wanted to teach them catechism. He noticed their sign language, that they were communicating with each other, and then he learned it and then developed it. So he looked at how do you use sign language to help deaf people to learn French, for example, and then communicate with them in French and in written French as well. So his approach was to teach them through sign language. And this was the first attempt for all children, poor and rich. Prior to that, the attempts were just for the rich, so they could have their inheritance, if they could show that they could vocalize and write. In Germany at the same time, another Lutheran pastor, Samuel Heinecke, was starting an approach that focused more on vocalization and lip reading. And so he felt that the best way to integrate deaf people into the hearing world was for them to be able to communicate through vocalization. And these two approaches grew up side by side. And first they weren't antagonistic, and they developed what they called the combined method. But gradually in 1880, we had a conference in Milan, attended mostly by hearing teachers of the deaf who had a preference for the oral method of deaf education. And they were able to convince governments that the oral method of deaf education was far superior to the manual method. And so this conflict developed, where you had schools, one favoring the manual method and others favoring the oral method. And that was even present in South Africa. The first school for the deaf was established in 1874 in Cape Town by Irish Dominican sisters. And the sister who came out initially, Sister Dimphina Kincaid, She had been a teacher at the School for the Deaf in Ireland, and she noticed that there were deaf children in Cape Town. So she established the deaf school in 1874 and employed a former pupil of hers from Ireland, Bridget Liney, to come and teach in the school. So the first deaf school in South Africa was a manual or sign language school based on Delapie's methodical signs. And then 10 years later, the King Williamstown Dominican Sisters started a school in King Williamstown. And they had been more influenced by the oral method of deaf education. So at the origins, in the Catholic Church at least, we had the oral and the manual methods. A lot of this transformation really happened in the 1920s, and governments were quite happy to sponsor the oral schools, but it was a very expensive form of education. So 1948, the apartheid government said, no, we'll only keep oral schools for the white and the colored communities, but not for the African communities. So the manual schools were for the African communities, and the white and some of the colored schools were oral. And that persisted until 1994, where the sign language schools developed. Now, total communication was a form of a combined method that they recognized in the 1970s, that even though they believed that oralism was far superior to the sign language method. Now, the drawback of the oral method was that schools spent a lot of time trying to teach deaf children how to vocalize and how to lip read. And there wasn't enough attention given to other subjects like mathematics and English and science and things like that, because they had to get this ability to lip read down pat. And so it had its limitations. But since 94, with the changes in our country, the government has permitted first sign language to be a language for education. And then now recently in 2023, it's been officially declared as the 12th official language in South Africa.
Your book powerfully echoes the late Pope Francis's call for the Church to be the merciful face of Christ in the world. How did the Dominican sisters respond to this call by educating deaf children who were often seen as different or marginalized?
I think when the schools for the deaf were started, it was way before Pope Francis. The church and religion itself has tried to show the merciful aspects of God's love for people. And so the whole history of the church's engagement with the deaf has been a story of mercy and benevolence and concern for them. By providing education, they were showing a merciful face, because before that, deaf people were in like a non-existence. They weren't even considered fully human. So with the advent of education and educating the deaf, it was a massive step forward. And many deaf people, even though they were trained orally, still are very thankful for the education they got from the Dominican schools here in South Africa and the schools for the deaf run by many of the other churches initially. The drawback with the oral method of education, however, was that they did this all with good conscience. Levinas distinguishes between good conscience and bad conscience, because he says we can do a lot of harm even though we act out of good conscience, because we intend to do good, but often we do it without enough awareness. The challenge was that even though they were benevolent and merciful, there was also the problem that they were keeping people in an inferior position because they could never quite fit into a hearing world. Rather than allowing deaf people and learn from deaf people and learn sign language, they were trying to remodel deaf people into being hearing people. And they were battling to do that. And so Levinas says that we need to often have a bad conscience. We need to have a troubled conscience. We think we're doing the right thing, but in fact, we need to be questioning ourselves. And he says the reality of people who are different is that they put us under question, whether our acts are actually benevolent and merciful, or are they actually maintaining a paradigm that is problematic. The priest who wrote the foreword to the book, Father Cyril Axelrod, he's very thankful for the education he got, but He sees that what the sisters missed was they didn't recognize that sign language itself was a gift from God. And it was a gift that deaf people can share with us, the hearing.
Your book closes by honouring deaf people in the Catholic Church who played a crucial role in helping others recognise their inherent dignity and in celebrating sign language as a gift from God. Could you tell us more about these people and the lasting impact they made?
I've focused in the book on, as a sort of third part, on the contributions deaf people in the Catholic Church have made. Obviously, this is a much broader category. I limited myself just to the Catholic Church. But I was able to uncover some very interesting accounts of a deaf academic at Wits University who studied under Philip Tobias, studied anatomy, and himself became a doctor of neurobiology at Wits, called Robert Simmons. And he had been at the St. Vincent School for the Deaf in Johannesburg. And he was a good friend of Father Cyril Axelrod, who I mentioned earlier. And Robert Simmons was very instrumental, and he gave the title for the book Proud to be Deaf, because in 1985 he gave a talk to the pupils at St. Vincent School for the Deaf and said to them, you know, we must be proud to be deaf. We mustn't see ourselves as second-class citizens. If people want to interact with us, we mustn't be worried about our inability to speak English well or to vocalize well. And he was one of the first in the Catholic Church, at least, to be able to articulate a new reality, a new world for deaf people, where it wasn't just a matter of them trying to fit into our hearing world, but really to recognize that we needed a new world where deaf and hearing could be together in a new way, in a more life-giving way for both groups. He wanted to be a rabbi, but like the Catholic Church prior to 1962, if you had any disability, you were not allowed to be ordained priest. And he wasn't able to become a rabbi because of the same requirements. But he had befriended a priest who was a chaplain to the deaf in Cape Town, Father Ernest Green, and he later became Bishop of PE, and he was very proficient in sign language. And he accepted Cyril to be a priest for his diocese in Port Elizabeth. And he paid for his education, and he studied and was ordained in 1971. And Cyril himself ministered in South Africa from that period right until 1987. And then he felt a call to go and work in Macau and in Hong Kong at that time to serve the Chinese deaf community there. And he had to learn Chinese and Chinese Sign Language, and he ministered there until he went blind. And he retired to England. But now in retirement, he felt it was too isolated in England. And so he's returned to Macau, where he continues to minister to the community there. And he also has at the heart of his theology the sense that his deafness and his blindness has been a gift from God. Now, I would never say that to a deaf person or to a blind person or to a disabled person myself, but he himself has come to that awareness that for him, it has become his way of ministering even to the hearing community. And he proved to be a great inspiration to many people who were going through difficulties in their lives. Another one is Ruben Klulu, who was a deaf artist who went deaf at the age of 7. And he was a fantastic sculptor in wood. Little is known of him until a book was written by Dina Cormack, who's an artist in Durban. And there was 2 sculptors, Bernard Gwenser and Ruben Klulu. Bernard was hearing, but Ruben was deaf. And they did a lot of artwork in enculturating church symbols into the Zulu and African context. So you have crucifixes of his showing Christ with African features crucified on the cross. And in one of his beautiful crucifixes, he was able to draw out of the wood on the side of Christ's face that I used as the cover for the book, the sort of outline of Africa. and he had very imaginative images of the Madonna and child. One, a very contemporary one of a young woman with a child on her hip carrying a stick of sugarcane, and the sort of secular model of the Madonna and child, and another one of a woman dressed as the wife of a king or a chief with the Zulu headdress, and instead of a spear, a crucifix, showing that a Zulu culture is not contrary to the Christian gospel, but is a means of expressing it, because so much of Christian art was a replication of Western art, that the figures were always white and carried Western symbols of authority and power and dominion. And here was an artist who was deaf, who was presenting a different image to the church of who Christ was in an African context. Another story that I've also got in the book is of a student at a school for the deaf in Cape Town in Witterboma, who was inspired by the Soweto riots in 76, and he led, there were a lot of other students there too, a protest against the school because of the way they were being treated as children and being severely disciplined. They had this rebellion and they wanted their education to go to matric, not just to grade 10. And the protest was like a beginning of deaf consciousness or deaf awareness. They wanted sign language as a medium of education and not being forced to do it in English. And so it developed from that. The protest wasn't successful, but it influenced the lives of those individuals who were involved. And they later started another organization called the Deaf Community of Cape Town. And they developed in the Western Cape an outreach to deaf people whose needs weren't being attended to. And that organization still continues to this day. Yeah, so I try and tell some of these stories in greater detail and show the significant contributions deaf people have made to their own struggle and freedom to get sign language acknowledged as a 12th language, and their own ability to build community amongst themselves and provide a new world for us all to live in.
That was Father Mark James discussing his book titled Proud to be Deaf.